Alrighty, we are closing in on the final rounds. Got about four more chapters to go. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you happen to be listening to this. We are at chapter 29 in the Great Society with my friend LBJ. Maybe. There we go.
President Kennedy was a reluctant participant in the emerging civil rights movement during the early 1960s. He was reluctant for two reasons. First, he was preoccupied with international crises and foreign policy during his short tenure as president. And second, he was very nervous about pushing civil rights for fear of alienating Southern Democratic congressmen on whose support he relied. As a result of that, initially, Kennedy did not promote civil rights activism. Over time, however, civil rights leaders, Martin Luther King Jr. and many others, took it upon themselves to organize demonstrations in the South, demonstrations that ultimately triggered violent reactions, including by the police in southern cities such as Birmingham. And those incidents eventually forced President Kennedy and his brother, Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, to use the force of the federal government, both the Justice Department and federal troops, to intervene in these very volatile situations in the South. So the civil rights movement dragged President Kennedy into its energy and forced him to take bolder and bolder action as the months passed.
Alrighty. So, 1960 election. We have Vice President Nixon. Remember, he is the vice president under Eisenhower for both Eisenhower's terms. He is nominated for the presidency, representing the Republicans, and the Democrats choose Senator John F. Kennedy, or JFK. He was sickly by nature, and he concealed his health issues through personal actions, much like FDR had. The election was marked by the first televised debate between presidential candidates. This turns out to be the closest election since 1888. Kennedy received 303 electoral votes and Nixon 219. There's only 574 votes between them. What screws it up for Nixon? The televised debates is one of the big things that kind of screws it up. He looks nervous and anxious, while Kennedy looks assured and confident. JFK was the youngest president elected, although Theodore Roosevelt was the youngest president ever to hold the office because he was younger when McKinley died. Kennedy chose to select for his administration leaders of industry instead of political appointees to provide fresh ideas. So these are the Kennedy-Nixon debates. John Kennedy's poise and precision in the debates with Richard Nixon impressed viewers and voters. And it's interesting, people who listened to the debates on the radio thought that Nixon won the debates. People who watched it on television thought Kennedy won them. So here's your election of 1960, and you can see how super close that is. About 100,000 votes or so difference, and very close to the electoral votes as well. Ooh, I also want to point out, Democrat. That's what Texas is voting, is Democrat. All right. Let's see. JFK's domestic program was called the New Frontier. He found many of his programs blocked by partisans in Congress. He did succeed in getting the Housing Act passed, which provided $5 billion for urban renewal over 4 years. The Supreme Court continued to be the decisive influence on domestic life in this era. The abolishment of prayer in schools, requiring a lawyer for every defendant regardless of ability to pay. And the notification of constitutional rights when being arrested are just some examples of the landmark cases that occurred during this time period under the Warren Court. All right. When JFK comes into office, he learns of a plan to arm Cuban refugees, return them to Cuba, and have them overthrow Castro. The plan, which landed the Cubans at the Bay of Pigs, ultimately fails. One of the biggest disasters and embarrassments of Kennedy's presidency. I will tell you, not the first time they tried to assassinate Castro. I don't know that it's the last, but either way, they had tried to kill Castro numerous times prior to that. 2 months after that, he meets with Khrushchev, who bullies and threatens the inexperienced Kennedy. Upon returning home, JFK calls up the Army Reserve and the National Guard. The Soviets respond by erecting the Berlin Wall, dividing West and East Berlin. That seems, yeah, okay. Anyway, basically, so this happens over in Cuba, Bay of Pigs, very embarrassing, etc. They are allied with the Soviet Union, the Cubans are, and that's where you get that connection with the Berlin Wall. So, I personally am not the biggest fan of Kennedy. There are records stating that prior to the wall being built, he did say, well, if they're trying to keep these people in, basically they're just going to have to build a wall. That's what they end up doing. And that wall basically goes up overnight. In 1962, Soviet missiles are discovered in Cuba. They were put there to protect Castro from another attempted coup. JFK placed a blockade around Cuba, not allowing anything in or out until the missiles were removed. On October 24th, Soviet ships stopped short of the quarantine line, and 2 days later, the Soviets agreed to remove the missiles. It's a little more concise. So we found out the missiles were there because we were flying secret missions over Cuba and checking things out. That's how we find out it's there. The missiles were there to protect the Cubans. They were aimed at the United States. Cuba is about 90 miles from Florida. Kennedy basically calls them up, tells them they need to move them. They say no. Kennedy tells the American public, and we're kind of in this very public standoff at that point. Eventually, the Soviets do remove the missiles. And the agreement is that we will walk away and we will leave Cuba alone and never bother them again, which is essentially what we do. So if you ever wondered why our relationship with Cuba was so terrible, big part of the reason why right there. All right. 2 West Berliners communicate with family members, visible in the open window on the upper right side of the apartment building on East Berlin's side of the newly constructed Berlin Wall. The wall physically divided the city and served as a wedge between the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, if they had been on the other side doing that, they'd have been killed by the East Berlin soldiers. All right, South Vietnam is still being supported by the might of the United States. However, the premier is showing an unwillingness to govern his people wisely or listen to American advice. As communist forces continue to invade the South, Kennedy dispatches military advisors to the region to train the soldiers. Fall of 1963, the United States supports a coup against the premier, and he was murdered. November 22nd, 1963, JFK is assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas on a motorcade, driving out just in the open. All right. Promoting their cause by nonviolent demonstrations, African Americans continue to protest the inequality of society. When 4 African American college students sat at a whites-only counter and refused to move, the concept of the sit-in was born. 1961, to test a federal order banning segregation of buses, the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, sent groups of people to trips across the country to make sure the law was upheld. These are called the Freedom Rides. 1962, Attorney General Robert Kennedy sent in troops to enforce a federal law abolishing segregation at the University of Mississippi when the governor refused to abide by it. The high point of the civil rights movement occurred at the March on Washington when Martin Luther King Jr. delivers his I Have a Dream speech. Okay, this is from the Greensboro sit-in. The Greensboro 4 students at North Carolina A&T College. Joseph McNeil, Franklin McCain, Billy Smith, and Clarence Henderson wait service on day 2 of their sit-ins at the wars. May 15th, 1961, a white mob in Alabama assaulted a Freedom bus, flinging firebombs into its windows and beating the activists as they emerged. Many of those were members of the KKK. Eugene Bull Connors police unleashed dogs on civil rights demonstrators in May of 1963. Going to be in Alabama. There's the March on Washington and the I Have a Dream speech. These people are on their way to the Lincoln Memorial and MLK's famous speech. All right. Robert Moses, who's an African-American, Harvard-educated New Yorker, leads a march on Mississippi's capital to protest the state's denial of the right to vote to minorities. His group's subsequent actions would lead to a revival of the KKK in the South. Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which ensured all citizens had the right to vote. It abolished literacy tests and other state policies designed at keeping African Americans from voting. All right. Race riot in Watts, a neighborhood in California, leads off a summer of racial violence in 1966. And groups of protesters supporting the Black Power took to the streets, and one of their leaders was Malcolm X. He was assassinated by a rival faction of black Muslims in 1964. Hopefully your book is a lot heavier on the details here. This is Malcolm X, Black Power movement's most influential spokesman. Until about a year before he dies, he was a very heavy-duty white racist. And he's Nation of Islam. He goes to Israel and meets other Muslims and kind of realizes that's not really what they're teaching. So he realizes that that hatred is not necessary, and he kind of starts to change his ways and becomes a lot more moderate. All right, Lyndon B. Johnson had been added to the ticket to provide balance to the inexperienced Kennedy. He continues Kennedy's domestic programs, and through his leadership has most of it passed. In 1964, he announced a war on poverty aimed at educating and elevating the nation's poor. LBJ is nominated for president in 1964 and faces Barry Goldwater, a senator from Arizona. The result is a landslide, with LBJ winning 61% of the vote. This is LBJ right there. President Johnson listens as Tom Fletcher, a father of 8 children, describes some of the economic problems in his hometown. Johnson was from Texas. He actually taught at a high school here in Houston for a year. Sam Houston High School, actually. On the north side of town. Anyway, so there's Johnson. In 1965, LBJ gets Congress to approve his Medicare program, which provides for health insurance for the aged. In the end, the Great Society generated 435 bills that would pass Congress, and the Great Society is modeled off of the New Deal, FDR's New Deal. The Immigration Act abolishes the use of quotas in allowing people to immigrate to the United States. These are quotas that had been in effect since 1920s and favored Northern Europeans. Although there were many programs in the Great Society that were successful, a good percentage of them were ill-conceived and poorly funded. As a result, they did not have the impact they intended or had unexpected effects, such as lowering the unemployment rate by paying welfare. LBJ inherited the policy of preventing communist supremacy in Indochina. He did not see any reason to save Vietnam, but since the United States was already committed, he saw no way to extricate the advisors. August 7th, 1964, LBJ appears on TV and informs the American public that the USS Maddox and the USS Chernarjoy had been fired on by the North Vietnamese vessels in the Gulf of Tonkin. He did not mention that they had been monitoring South Vietnamese attacks on North Vietnamese troops planned by American advisors. He asked Congress for a resolution authorizing the president to take all necessary steps to repeal attacks against U.S. forces. He receives it. It is called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. By March of 1965, combat troops begin to arrive in Vietnam. So this legislation, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, basically allows him to do whatever he thinks is necessary. And that is going to be the nail in his coffin. LBJ's decision to go into Vietnam was consistent with the foreign policies of all presidents back to Truman. At the time, military intervention was the logical next step for him to take. In the Battle of Wills, the North Vietnamese won, as public support in the United States eroded. So there's Vietnam, 1966. You have North Vietnam, you have South Vietnam. We kind of went off of the domino theory, basically. If Vietnam falls to communism, so will Laos and Cambodia, and so on and so forth. January 31st, 1968, the Viet Cong launched an attack on South Vietnam that was dubbed the Tet Offensive, due to it occurring on the Vietnamese New Year. Although it was beaten back and was a staggering loss for the Viet Cong, the American public viewed it as a tremendous loss. LBJ's popularity declined 35%, leading him to announce that he would not seek a second term on his own in the 1968 election. Vietnamese mother hides her son and herself in the bushes near My Lai in 1965 after U.S. Marines murdered Vietnamese villagers. So, go us, yay. Vietnam War sapped the spirit of Lyndon B. Johnson, who decided not to run for re-election in 1968. Basically, he didn't think he would have the support of his party, nor did he think he would have the support of the American public. So he does decide to not run. So, 1968 is a very, very traumatic year in U.S. history. You have the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., also of Senator Robert Kennedy that June, who just clinched the Democratic nomination for president. And that would have put him against Nixon. And likely he would have won. And there would have been, I do believe he probably would have been a very good president at that. Much better than his brother. At the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, Mayor Richard Daley ordered 20,000 police and National Guardsmen to keep order, but when they could not, anxious reporters broadcast the riots across the nation. The Democrats eventually nominated Herbert Humphrey for president. The Republicans at their convention in Miami chose Richard Nixon. A third-party candidate, George Wallace, runs as an independent in the South. He was the governor of Alabama. Nixon enjoyed a tremendous lead in the polls and won by 500,000 votes, although it was not as close in electoral votes, 301 to 191. And there's the map. Again, Texas voting Democrat. In the next election, when Nixon runs again, we actually switch to Republican at that point, and we will vote for Nixon at that point. That is all I have for today. That was a quick one. Hopefully the rest of these will go so quickly. But anyway, I hope you have a wonderful afternoon, morning, afternoon, or evening, whenever you happen to be listening to this, and I will see or speak to you soon. Bye.